In this video presentation I shall discuss chapter-wise summary of the novel Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Now my dear students, I welcome you all to my educational channel. The name of my educational channel is Priyanka Datta. Here you will find video presentations on English language and literature of school level, college level as well as of competitive examinations. Now let us move to the main focus of this video presentation. Chapter 1. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. The business of her life was to get her daughters married, its solace was visiting and news. Summary. 1. The Bennet couple has 5 daughters. Mrs. Bennet wants to get them married. 2. Therefore she informs her husband about the arrival of Mr. Bingley, a rich bachelor, to Netherfield Park. 3. She tells him to invite Mr. Bingley to their house in Longbourn with the hope that Mr. Bingley will be attracted to one of their daughters. 4. Mr. Bennet says that he is not much interested in paying a social visit to Mr. Bingley. In fact, every now and then, he does not pay any attention to her words and makes the already nervous Mrs. Bennet more nervous. 5. However, Mr. Bennet says that he will be happy to see Elizabeth as the wife of Mr. Bingley. Mrs. Bennet however opines that she will be happy to see Mr. Bingley marrying either Jane or Lydia. Chapter 2. Mr. Bennet was among the earliest of those who waited on Mr. Bingley. The rest of the evening was spent in conjecturing how soon he would return Mr. Bennet's visit, and determining when they should ask him to dinner. Summary. 1. Mr. Bennet informs that he has already paid a visit to Mr. Bingley. 2. Mrs. Bennet thinks that her husband has done a very good thing. 3. Elizabeth informs that Mrs. Lang has promised to introduce the Bennet sisters with Mr. Bingley. 4. Mrs. Bennet thinks that Mrs. Lang will not do so because she has 2 nieces to be married. 5. However, a ball is going to be arranged soon. 6. Mrs. Bennet hopes that Lydia will dance with Mr. Bingley there. 7. Lydia tells that she is prepared to dance with Mr. Bingley and even to marry him. Chapter 3. Not all that Mrs. Bennet, however, with the assistance of her 5 daughters, could ask on the subject, was sufficient to draw from her husband any satisfactory description of Mr. Bingley. I quite detest the man. Summary. 1. Mr. Bingley pays a return visit to the Bennet household. 2. Only Mr. Bennet is at home. 3. Thereupon the Bennet family invite Mr. Bingley to dine with them one evening. 4. Mr. Bingley says of his inability of keeping the invitation at present because he has to go to London for a few days. 5. Mr. Bingley returns with a number of his friends and relatives. 6. An assembly is arranged. 7. Mr. Bingley attends it with his 2 sisters, a husband of one of the sisters and his friend Mr. Darcy. 8. All the girls present there want to marry Mr. Bingley or Mr. Darcy. 9. Mr. Bingley is greatly attracted to Jane, the eldest of the Bennet sisters. He even dances with her twice. 10. Mr. Darcy tells Mr. Bingley that there is no girl in the assembly who draws his attention. However, he dances twice, once with Mrs. Hurst, the married sister of Mr. Bingley, and Miss Bingley, the unmarried sister of Mr. Bingley. 11. He adds that there is not much charm in Elizabeth. Mr. Bingley however says that Elizabeth is a very pretty girl. 12. Elizabeth overhears the conversation and so becomes very much annoyed with Darcy. 13. Mrs. Bennet returns home with her daughters and tells her husband in detail about the assembly, especially about Mr. Bingley's interest in Jane and Mr. Darcy's rude behavior. Chapter 4. When Jane and Elizabeth were alone, the former who had been cautious in her praise of Mr. Bingley before, expressed to her sister just now how very much she admired him. Miss Bennet was therefore established as a sweet girl, and their brother felt authorized by such commendation to think of her as he chose. Summary. 1. Jane tells Elizabeth that she has developed a liking for Mr. Bingley. 2. Elizabeth however tells that Jane looks at everything simply and so does not find fault with anything. 3. Jane tells Elizabeth that Mr. Bingley has enough property but has not been able to buy a house of his own. She adds that at present Mr. Bingley is living in Netherfield Park on rent with his unmarried sister Miss Bingley, his other sister Mrs. Hurst and her husband Mr. Hurst. 4. The two friends, Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy, speak about the assembly held at Meryton. Mr. Bingley says that he has got sincere attention from one and all. He adds that the girls who were present there were the prettiest of the girls he had seen. Mr. Darcy tells that he has not received any attention from anybody. He adds that he has found all the people of the assembly to be lacking in beauty. He goes to the extent of saying that even Miss Jane Bennet has not attracted him much. Chapter 5. Within a short walk of Longbourn lived a family with whom the Bennets were particularly intimate. The boy protested that she should not, she continued to declare that she would, and the argument ended only with the visit. Summary. 1. Sir William Lucas had business in the city of Meryton. He made considerable money from it. At that time he lived in his house in Meryton. 2. Now he has left his business and his house in Meryton and lives with his family, Lady Lucas and Miss Charlotte Lucas, in the village named Longbourn. 3. Sir William Lucas is very polite in his nature in spite of being honoured with knighthood by the king. 4. There is an intimate relationship between the members of the Bennet family and the Lucas family. 5. In the course of time Miss Elizabeth Bennet develops intimate friendship with Miss Charlotte Lucas, the eldest of the Lucas children. 6. Miss Charlotte Lucas, Miss Elizabeth Bennet, Miss Jane Bennet and Mrs. Bennet speak about Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy. Charlotte thinks that since Mr. Darcy is rich he has every reason to become proud. Elizabeth thinks that Mr. Darcy can be proud but he has no right to speak ill about others. Jane thinks that Mr. Darcy does not speak with those whom he does not know closely and that people misinterpret it to be his pride. Mrs. Bennet does not have any doubt that the pride of Mr. Darcy is a part of his character. Chapter 6. The ladies of Longbourn soon waited on those of Netherfield. He listened to her with perfect indifference while she chose to entertain herself in this manner, and as his composure convinced her that all was safe, her wit followed long. Summary. 1. The Bennet girls and the Lucas girls go to the rented house of Mr. Bingley in Netherfield Park. 2. Miss Hurst, the married sister of Mr. Bingley, and Miss Bingley, the unmarried sister of Mr. Bingley, pay special interest to Jane Bingley. 3. Charlotte Lucas opines that Mr. Bingley has developed a sort of fascination for Jane. She adds that Jane Bennet should not be slow in responding to Mr. Bingley's advances. However, she is not jealous of Jane. 4. Elizabeth feels that there is a lack of emotional involvement in the behavior of Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst. However, she feels that Jane Bennet has already encouraged Mr. Bingley to court her. 5. In the meantime Mr. Darcy has changed his perception about Elizabeth. In fact he begins to think that the beautiful expression in her dark eyes makes her look exceptionally intelligent. However, Elizabeth remains unaware of this change of attitude in Mr. Darcy. 6. A large party is arranged in the house of Sir William Lucas. Elizabeth and Mary provide musical entertainment to one and all. Mr. Darcy does not like singing and dancing and so does not find any interest in the said entertainment. 7. Mr. Darcy tells Miss Bingley about the beautiful expression in the dark eyes of Elizabeth. However, as Miss Bingley is thinking of her marriage with Darcy, she is shocked. Chapter 7. Mr. Bennet's property consisted almost entirely in an estate of 2,000 a year, which, unfortunately for his daughters, was entailed in default of heirs male, on a distant relation, and their mother's fortune, though ample for her situation in life, could but ill supply the deficiency of his. Elizabeth most thankfully consented. A servant was dispatched to Longbourn to acquaint the family with her stay and bring back a supply of clothes. Summary. 1. Mr. Bennet has 5 daughters but no male heir. His property will therefore go to a distant relative, namely Mr. Collins, after his death. Thus the prospect of the family members is a bleak one. 2. Mrs. Bennet has a brother and a sister. Her sister, Mrs. Phillips, lives in Meryton, which is only a mile away from the village named Longbourn. 3. Catherine and Lydia pay frequent visits to their aunt Mrs. Phillips in Meryton. 4. A militia regiment has been stationed close to the town of Meryton. Catherine and Lydia feel very excited about it because they are very interested in the military officers. 5. Miss Bingley sends a note for Jane through a servant. Here she invites Jane for a dinner and also informs that Mr. Bingley and other gentlemen will not be at home. 6. Everybody in the Bennet family becomes happy to hear it. 7. Mr. Bennet cannot spare the family carriage for Jane. Therefore Jane rides on horseback to go to Netherfield Park. 8. A few minutes after Jane starts for Netherfield Park, it starts to rain and she becomes drenched by the time she reaches there. 9. As a result, Jane catches a cold and so cannot return the next morning. She informs Elizabeth through a note of her illness and of her inability to return till she gets well. 10. Mrs. Bennet thinks that it is a great opportunity on the part of Jane to become more intimate with Mr. Bingley. 11. Elizabeth thinks that Jane is ill and so will find herself lonely. So she decides to pay a visit to Netherfield Park. 12. No carriage is available. Therefore Elizabeth walks the distance of about 3 miles from Longbourn to Netherfield Park. 13. A doctor by the name of Mr. Jones comes in. On examining Jane he concludes that she has got a violent cold and needs complete rest. 14. Jane wants Elizabeth to stay. Therefore Elizabeth decides to stay at Netherfield Park for the night. Chapter 8. At 5 o'clock 2 ladies retired to dress, and at 6:30 Elizabeth was summoned to dinner. They solaced their wretchedness, however, by duets after supper, while he could find no better relief to his feelings than by giving his housekeeper directions that every attention might be paid to the sick lady and his sister. Summary. 1. Jane's condition becomes a little worse and so Elizabeth has to stay with Jane at Netherfield Park. 2. It is decided that Mr. Jones will be called again to check upon Jane. 3. Jane's prolonged sickness is the cause of worry for Mr. Bingley and his sisters. After all, it is in order to keep their invitation that she has become ill. 4. All the people staying at Netherfield Park decide to play cards. Elizabeth, however, decides to spend time reading a book. 5. In the course of conversation with Mr. Darcy, Miss Bingley asks whether Miss Darcy has grown as tall as herself. In reply, Mr. Darcy deliberately refers to Elizabeth by saying that Miss Darcy is about the height of Elizabeth or taller. 6. Miss Bingley describes Miss Darcy in glowing terms with a view to impress Mr. Darcy. Chapter 9. Elizabeth passed the chief of the night in her sister's room, and in the morning had the pleasure of being able to send a tolerable answer to the inquiries which she very early received from Mr. Bingley by a housemaid, and some time afterwards from the 2 elegant ladies who waited on his sisters. Mrs. Bennet and her daughters then departed, and Elizabeth returned instantly to Jane, leaving her own and her relations' behaviour to the remarks of the 2 ladies and Mr. Darcy, the latter of whom, however, could not be prevailed on to join in their censure of her, in spite of all Miss Bingley's witticisms on fine eyes. Summary. 1. Mrs. Bennet comes to Netherfield Park with Lydia and Catherine to have a look at Jane. She becomes satisfied to see that Jane is out of danger. 2. However, Mrs. Bennet does not want Jane to be removed to Longbourn at this stage. The doctor, namely Mr. Jones, advises in the same line. Mr. Bingley supports the view of the physician. 3. Mrs. Bennet tells Mr. Bingley not to leave Netherfield Park in a hurry. In reply, Mr. Bingley says that he is in the habit of acting in a hurry. However, he adds that he has made up his mind to stay at Netherfield Park for a very long time, almost permanently. 4. Lydia reminds Mr. Bingley of his promise of giving a ball at his residence. Mr. Bingley says that he will do so after the complete recovery of Jane and on a day which suits Jane. Chapter 10. The day passed much as the day before had done. Jane was already so recovered as to intend to leave her room for a couple of hours that evening. Summary. 1. Miss Bingley leaves no opportunity to impress Darcy. She goes to the extent of flattery which, being wrong, fails to impress Mr. Darcy. 2. Elizabeth, Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley become involved in a conversation. Elizabeth tells Mr. Bingley that he is a very modest man. Mr. Darcy opposes Elizabeth and says that Mr. Bingley is a boastful man and that his modesty is an appearance. Mr. Bingley prevents the conversation from being bitter. 3. Mr. Darcy offers to dance with Elizabeth, with Miss Bingley playing the piano and Mrs. Hurst singing. Elizabeth immediately rejects the offer. 4. However, Darcy is still impressed by Elizabeth. He thinks that if she gets some special social status, she can easily be his wife. 5. Miss Bingley does not like the interest of Mr. Darcy in Elizabeth. She wants Elizabeth to go back home. She also takes pain to keep Elizabeth away from Mr. Darcy.